your recipes for a sweet life. I'm back today with one of my favorite, most popular and recently released stencil sets, and it's called Live Sweetly, which is my favorite tagline, so that's also particularly handy. It's a bakery themed set that was designed for Audrey, a guest of honor at a bat mitzvah a few months ago, and when I posted some of her cookies online, I got a tremendous response, and so I decided to generalize the set for all of you out there in the general public. I stripped out the Audrey references, added a few other embellishments, and we've got a really, really fun set here today. I'm going to be making use of a lot of handmade embellishments today, some of which use the stencil set, some of which don't. They're made with a combination of fondant and royal icing. There are many, 8 or 9, and so I've relegated those all to a separate video where we'll go into each in depth because they're super fun, and not only would they work on these stencil sets, but they would work on any other kind of sweet cupcake, cake, or what have you. Just as a reminder, all of my stencils can be found on confectioncouturestencils.com. They're my stencil partner. If you join my Stencil of the Month Club, you'll also get 15 to 20% off on each monthly release, as well as 15% off on everything on the site as long as you stay a member. So it's a terrific deal. Now, let's talk about what we'll need to make these bakery-themed cookies. First of all, you need some iced cookies, nice and flat. I often work with white in my videos just because the designs really pop off them for display purposes, but any light colored background would work really well with this set. Here are a couple of finished examples. This particular one uses both the message and frame set. As a reminder, my dynamic duo sets consist of 2 sets designed to work together. The background set actually has an extra element, which is this Swiss dot pattern, so I'll be showing you how to use that. It's got essentially 2 backgrounds instead of 1, so this is an extra jazzed up set. And here's an example of a cookie with just the background set in use. So you can mix and match both sets together. The stencils will come to you in a pack that looks something like this, that's got great stenciling directions for these layered designs inside. I also have, of course, all of these videos that you can reference for detailed instructions. And the background set contains this pretty little bakery awning and set of shelves onto which we'll be layering various items, as well as a bunch of other stuff, including that dotted piece I just mentioned, but we'll get into that in the next segment. The complementary message and frame set includes messages, of course. There you've got Live Sweetly and a bunch of others, frames and other pieces, which we'll get into a little bit later. You may also need to make use of my quadrant masking tool. This is useful for shading off areas that are very close to one another so that you don't get overspray into adjacent areas. To keep all those stencils in place while stenciling, you'll need a frame, at least to hold the background stencil. I like to use the Stencil Genie, which is a magnetized piece that holds it nice and flat against the cookie. To secure some of the masking elements that leave space for some of the elements we put on top, I like to use painter's tape because it comes off the stencils rather easily. Sometimes I weight it down additionally with magnets. And other times I'll use a trussing needle if pieces are lifting to really hold things in place. One thing about this stencil is it has heavy use of stripes in it in the awning. And those are particularly hard to stencil because they tend to blow apart, especially if you airbrush crosswise against them and not with the grain of the stripe. So this video will also have some special technique associated with how to properly airbrush stripes so you don't get a lot of underspray or a shadow effect around them. And the trussing needle comes in handy for that. I mentioned all those fun embellishments that we've got to put on the cookies that I'll be showing in the next video. These are made of fondant, little mini rolling pins, and strawberries. But all the rest are made of royal icing. Oops, I take that back. These little message plaques and cupcakes are made out of rolled fondant, airbrushed on using the stencil set in this case. And then the remainder of the decorations, little macaroons, mini tarts, mini pies, which you don't see here, various breads, are all made with royal icing of different consistencies. And again, that's the subject of the next video. To airbrush, of course, you need airbrush colorings. I make use of about 5 or 6 colors in this particular video. Not all on the same cookie, 5 probably on the same cookie, but not all 6. Of course, you need an airbrush system. Here's my Julia airbrush. And I've got a compressor underneath that actually powers the airbrush. It's helpful when you're working with multiple colors to have multiple airbrushes, one for each color. It's an investment, but it rapidly pays itself back because you don't have all the time in swapping out colors and cleaning out airbrushes in between them. I have a whole nother video that talks about the economies of investing in multiple airbrushes if you're doing a lot of it. So let's move on to the first segment that's going to talk about how to apply the background set and that dot overlay. Okay, on the background set, let's explore what's in it in more detail. You saw the background earlier. I've actually masked off an area of it already to accommodate a little mixing bowl and rolling pin. Stuck it down with some tape, and that's going to lay first on the cookie. But with the set, you've got so many possibilities for masks. I've got a little one for a tray of macarons, another one for cupcakes, another one for a little mini cake with a cherry on top, and another with a set of canisters. So lots of different possibilities, and you can anchor them anywhere on the cookie. You can put them on the plate on the background or off to the side as I did with the mixing bowls. Now, putting those masks down will leave room for stenciling in that piece. But first, sometimes I will apply a shadow around it. This is just the negative piece that's left over after cutting out the masks. In this case, these elements are so real, I find that the shadow somehow kind of fuzzes them out as opposed to accentuating them. So I probably won't use this piece here, and I'll move directly on to working with the stencils and filling in the void with the actual stencil sheet. So this is the piece that I've masked off and what we'll be picking up in stencil form. Now this background set is extra deluxe because it has an entirely new kind of concept in it, which is this extra sheet. It's a polka dot overlay. And this I will set on last and spray a light color over it, trying to avoid all the places previously airbrushed to leave a little background pattern underneath the awning. So this covers the awning, and this will be airbrushed around all the other details we put down. We'll do that last. So let's get started. I'm going to be heading towards something that has a mixing bowl on it. This void on the plate will probably fill with another dimensional element towards the end of the video. Now with the background stencil safely secured in the stencil genie, we're ready to start airbrushing. I'm going to start with the light green here in the awning. The key with stripes, as in the awning, is to make sure you spray along the length of the stripe as opposed to crosswise, and to do so gradually. This way you'll get less underspray. You also want to hold down those stripes with your trussing needle to the greatest extent possible. I'm going to add a little green down to the plate here and then move on to gold here in the baskets at the bottom. One thing to also note is that I've got the stencil genie additionally weighted down with 2 blue molds at the top and the bottom. That's because the genie wasn't laying flat on its own because the underlying cookie was kind of curved. This is keeping the stencil ultra flat against the cookie, which is crucial. Again, here on the shelves, which are long horizontal stripes, be careful to spray along the length of the shelf and also along the length of the rails. I'm going to add a little highlighting with dark brown also to the baskets. So let's remove those molds and see what that looks like. Ta-da, beautiful, with a nice clear space left for the mixing bowl, which we will stencil in next. This stencil clearly won't fit in the genie because it overhangs the cookies, so I'm going to weight it down with magnets and also mask off the areas that I don't want to spray with my quadrant masking tool to the upper left. I'm going to hit this with 3 colors, gold for the whisk and part of the rolling pin, red for the bowl and the handles, and a highlight of brown through the middle part of the rolling pin. The other technique detail to note is that these are tightly spaced areas with colors going down in close proximity to one another, so it's important to spray very close to the cookie to prevent overspray into adjoining areas. However, in doing so, you need to make sure that you've got a relatively low coloring flow coming through the airbrush, otherwise you'll get pooling of coloring on top and underspray underneath the stencil. I'm going to hit the bowl now with red. I'm going to do this in stages so I make sure that I get a nice even coloring throughout the bowl. You don't want to apply it too heavily because again you can get pooling and that will lead to underspray. And lastly, for that shading of brown I mentioned. That looks great. Ta-da! Now we're ready for the dot overlay as the last step. This piece will fit in the genie conveniently and cover the whole cookie, which is perfect. It's important though to use a light color here because if you use a dark one, it will easily show if you happen to overspray into one of the areas already stenciled. So I'm using a light pink here. And again, I'm applying it gradually, a light tone first, and then going back over to even it out so I get a nice uniform pink color across the entirety of the stencil. Being careful here to spray between the baskets and also at the bottom. Touching down with my trussing needle to keep the stencil flat as necessary. So let's see what that looks like. Absolutely beautiful. Okay, I want to move on to my message and frame set and show how it can be used in conjunction with the background set. You saw those 4 messages before, but to get them down, you also need to mask off an area of the background to accommodate them. And that's what these various masking pieces come in handy for. These mask off the frames that will surround the messages. There are 3 here because I've pre-masked the background with the one I'm going to use, I think. I've just taped it down with a little tape as I did before. Same process as with just using the masking pieces in the background set. Once I mask it off, I often do like to use the shading stencil in this case. I didn't use it in the past segment, but here this will create a little shadow around the message. Then I'll come in with the frame that I'm selecting out, this one here in this case, and then typically I come back in with the message and center it in the frame because it's easier to do that once I've got the frame down. So let's see how that works. We're going to be stenciling that directly on the cookie. In the last segment, when I start putting dimensional elements on, I'm going to show an option of actually putting on a separate fondant message and frame that was airbrushed on its own, cut out, and then put on the cookie, and that just adds that much more dimension. Now I'm going to airbrush the background of this cookie much the same way as I did the first one, that is with the same colors, but using a mask for the frame. I'm going to hit the awning with light green, again with stripes. Make sure to really hold them down with your trussing needle as you spray near them so they don't blow open, and also spray along the length of the stripe. And hit this plate down here. This stencil is kind of lifting up more than usual, so I'm going to weigh it down additionally with some magnets. Now onto the dark green. Be sure to spray rather close to the stencil with low coloring flow because you really don't want that dark green in the light green areas. And again, down to the baskets with the gold. And then dark brown on the shelves, spraying along the length of the shelves to prevent underspray. That looks great with a nice clear area left for the message. But first I'm going to put a shadow behind the message using the shading stencil. This doesn't fit into the genie, so I'm weighing it down with magnets as before and using my quadrant tool to mask off the areas I don't want to spray. Here my stenciling technique is a little bit different. I'm shading at a much greater distance, about 5 inches from the cookie with very low coloring flow, just to get a touch of pink there around the edges. And that looks great. I'm going to come back in now with the frame stencil, weigh that down just as I did the shading stencil, and then hit it with red, I believe here, working at a 90-degree angle to the cookie to prevent underspray. And lastly, we're ready for the message stencil, which is easiest to center in the frame once the frame is down. Now this message fits perfectly, but mind you, many of the messages are interchangeable with frames, so you don't have to stick with necessarily one message combination and frame combination. But I do like the first message I tried in the frame, so I'm going to stick with that. Weighing it down just as I did the frame stencil with the quadrant masking tool and a magnet, and spraying at a 90-degree angle. And for the reveal, ta-da, that looks great. I'm going to skip the Swiss dot here and move on to embellishing this cookie in a later step. So I'm a more is more person, as you know, so we're going to jazz up the one I just airbrushed with some of those dimensional elements I had at the opening of the video. As I said, many of them are made with the same stencil set, this particular piece. For instance, the little cupcakes are rolled fondant that have been airbrushed with the cupcake pattern. The little baskets here are actually airbrushed with the background stencil. I picked up the basket in it, this element, cut it out, and then shaped it. So that's possibly something that could go there, and I could fill it with some other little doodads. These are all piped royal icing. I've got different French breads, little macarons, so they could conceivably go here. One thing I like to do before I put anything on the cookie is just array all of the options and arrange them and see what I like best in terms of balance of color and size and quantity of shapes. But I don't like so much pink and red together, so I don't think I'm going to use that particular configuration. So let's move on to these elements, see if they'll work. I've got these cute little fondant rolling pins with little royal icing handles, and that could be cute down here, quite honestly. So that's a possibility. We'll set it aside. Also, fondant strawberries with a little bit of royal icing greenery on them. Assorted flowers, which I've done in countless other videos, so I won't be sharing them in any video anytime soon. You'll have to refer back to my old videos. I've got little tarts and pies at various stages of completion, so that could look cute situated there. I've also got canisters that were made using the same stencil set, both dimensional ones made with piped royal icing transfers and also ones flat on fondant. And I think one of those is going to look particularly cute just sitting up on this plate. The red kind of balances out the message here. And I did like a lot of these little macarons and tarts. So currently what I'm thinking is potentially situating these guys here. That draws in the green from over here. And maybe covering that mistake, that little spotty part of spraying with some bigger bows and a little whimsical flower to go something like that. So that's where I'm headed after surveying all these design elements. And the fun thing is every single cookie can look a little different depending on what stencils you apply in the background and what stuff you put on top. So I'm going to clear these guys to the side and work on this cookie. The first order of the day, though, is getting a border down. I do think I want to trim it out with a pink border just to draw in the pink from the shading on the inside of the message. Again, my aim is always to balance the color, especially when I've got a lot across the entire cookie. For that beaded border, I use icing of beadwork consistency naturally. I talk about that consistency adjustment in several other videos. I also have a link to it in the video description, so I won't belabor that point here. Instead, we'll move on to attaching the embellishments. But do let that border dry before you start attaching stuff because you don't want to inadvertently hit it and mess it up. Now to attach the canister, I'm going to elevate it with a little blob of fondant and some royal icing glue. I thought that extra lift might just add more dimension to the cookie, and I think that looks really nice. You could also attach it directly to the cookie, as I'm going to do with the macaron and tart here. So you have a couple different options. In all cases, though, I'm using thick white royal icing as the glue. The thicker the icing is, the faster it'll dry. And also, if you make a mistake, the white is a little bit easier to clean off the cookie. So I'm just going to attach it here. A little dab of glue will do ya. Up here at the rose, I just need to attach one more bow loop, and that will finish it off. Of course, if you have any white royal icing glue sticking out, by all means clean it up. And then lastly, I'm just going to finish off the seams of that rose and bow with some leaves made with Atico and Wilton 349 leaf tips. That looks just great. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's a pretty dark and thunderous day behind me. I'm hoping, though, that this video brightened your mood. You've seen now how my background set works in tandem with the message and frame set for my new fave, Live Sweetly set. And you saw just one way to possibly embellish it here in this cookie here. I'm going to pause and show you a couple other ways you might go about embellishing and then direct you to my next video, which is going to show how I made all these doodads. So here's another version which uses the background set with the airbrushing and stenciling of the canisters directly on the cookie, but I used a dimensional basket made of fondant and hand-piped French breads and challah breads and macarons, all made of royal icing, to fill that basket, which is pretty cool. Oh, the thing I love in particular is this was intended to look like a broken egg and a mound of flour, which is actually powdered sugar, all stuck down with a little bit of icing. The yolk is a royal icing transfer, and the white is a little bit of piping gel to give it a little bit of gloss. Here we've got a piece where most of the elements have been airbrushed and stenciled directly on the background of the cookie, with the exception of the rose and the bows at the top. It's also got the added dimension of the little polka dot overlay, which I think is completely sweet. Here, another one similar to one we saw earlier. Directly airbrushed here are the macarons on a pedestal instead of the canisters, and I've got a similar little basket, though in green, filled with challah. And then lastly, some of my favorite embellishments are on this piece. a fondant stenciled piece to give some dimension to the cupcakes, but this cute fondant rolling pin extruded with a little extruding tool and then piped royal icing handles. Beautiful little pie, chocolate cream pie on top, and another little open-faced tart. So lots of possibilities here. I encourage you to use your imagination. Till next video, live sweetly.